On the morning of August 8, 1840, the people of Linnville, Texas woke to hundreds of riders pouring out of the dawn. Linnville was the second busiest port in the young Republic of Texas, a thriving harbor town on Lavaca Bay. Within minutes, the townspeople understood there was no time to fight. There was barely even time to run. Men, women, and children waded into the bay, scrambling into rowboats and a small schooner anchored offshore. From the water, they watched a Comanche war party of hundreds ride into their streets completely unopposed. For most of a day, the raiders looted every warehouse and store, and then they set the whole town ablaze. The people of Linnville floated in the shallows and watched their homes and their livelihoods burn to the ground. It was the largest raid native warriors ever launched against a town in what is now the United States. And it was the answer to a betrayal. To understand it, we go back a few months and back 100 years. By the early 1800s, the Comanche ruled a territory the size of a nation, sprawling across Texas and far beyond. They called it Comancheria, and for 100 years they held it against the Spanish, the Mexicans, and the Texans. At their height, the Comanche were counted in the tens of thousands, a true power that rivaled any on the plains. They traded and raided across a range that touched Mexico, New Mexico, Kansas, and the deep heart of Texas. Their power rested on one thing above all others: the horse. No people on the continent could ride or raid like them. A Comanche boy learned to ride almost before he could walk, and to fight from horseback soon after. For generations, the rule was simple: the plains belonged to the Comanche, and outsiders entered at their own risk. To the Comanche, land was never something you owned with paper. It was something you held with strength and skill. Then, through the 1820s and 30s, a new force pushed into their world: the settlers of a young Texas. The newcomers wanted farms, fences, and permanent towns on land the Comanche had ruled for lifetimes. The two ways of life couldn't share the same ground, and by 1840 the pressure had reached a breaking point. Strangely, the road to the Great Raid began not with an attack, but with an attempt to make peace. By 1840, both sides were exhausted by years of raiding, killing, and the taking of captives along the frontier. For years, the Comanche had carried captives back to the plains, and the settlers had done much the same in return. Peace, both sides hoped, might finally stop the endless traffic of stolen livestock and burned homesteads. But trust was thin, and neither side truly understood how the other saw the meeting they were about to hold. Comanche leaders sent word that they wanted to talk, to settle a boundary, and finally end the bloodshed. In March of 1840, a delegation of Comanche chiefs rode into San Antonio to meet with Texas officials. They gathered at a stone building just off the main plaza, a place history would remember as the council house. The Texans had come with one demand above all others: the return of every captive the Comanche held. The Comanche brought in a single young captive named Matilda Lockhart, who had plainly suffered in captivity. Her condition enraged the Texans, who believed the Comanche were hiding more prisoners to trade one at a time. The officials announced that the chiefs would be held as hostages until every other captive was returned. Armed soldiers began filing into the room. To the surrounded, disarmed Comanche, it looked exactly like a trap. In a heartbeat, fighting exploded inside the council house and burst out into the streets of San Antonio. When the smoke cleared, some 35 Comanche lay dead, including a dozen chiefs who had come only to talk. Several others of the delegation, women among them, were killed or captured. A handful of Texans died too. To the Texans, it felt like justice finally delivered. To the Comanche, it was an unforgivable betrayal. Killing envoys who came under a flag of truce broke the deepest law the Comanche held about honor. This was not a raid gone wrong. It was murder in a room meant for peace. Word of the council house fight raced across Comancheria, and everywhere it went, it left a thirst for revenge. There would be no more talking. There would be a reckoning on a scale that no Texan imagined possible. The Comanche answer gathered around a war chief the Texans would soon learn to fear: Buffalo Hump. His own people knew him as Potsunakwahipu, a respected leader of the Southern Penateka Band. In the months after the council house, he did something the Comanche almost never did. He united the bands. Warriors rode in from across Comancheria, drawn together by grief, by fury, and by the promise of revenge. By the height of summer, Buffalo Hump had assembled one of the largest war parties in Comanche history. Runners carried his call across hundreds of miles, from the winter canyons to the summer hunting grounds. Estimates run from 400 to as many as 1,000 people, warriors riding out with their families. This was no lightning strike on a lonely cabin. It was an invasion aimed straight at the Texas settlements, and Buffalo Hump fixed his eyes on a target no Comanche army had ever reached: the sea itself. The plan was breathtaking. Ride hundreds of miles through settled country, all the way to the Gulf Coast. They would strike fast, seize everything of value, and be gone before Texas could raise an army. Speed and surprise had always been the Comanches' sharpest weapons, and both were firmly on their side. To reach the coast, they would gamble that no town in their path could stop or even slow them. In early August of 1840, the Great Column turned south, and the ground itself seemed to tremble. The war party swept down the Guadalupe River Valley with a speed that stunned everyone in its path. They slipped past forts and larger towns, hitting isolated homes and moving on before any alarm could spread. Settlers who saw the dust rising on the horizon often mistook it for a cattle drive until it was too late. The column stretched for miles, warriors riding in the lead, families and spare horses trailing behind. Everything depended on reaching the coast before the scattered settlements could unite into one army. Along the way, small parties peeled off to strike isolated farms, spreading terror far beyond the main column. Word at last began to race ahead of them, but no one could agree on where the blow would land. Many simply refused to believe it. Surely, they said, the Comanche would never ride all the way to the ocean. The first town squarely in their path was Victoria, a prosperous settlement on the Guadalupe River. Nothing about that quiet August morning warned Victoria of what was already riding toward it. On August 6th, the raiders appeared outside Victoria without warning, catching the whole town off guard. Residents barricaded themselves inside stone houses as hundreds of riders circled the edges of the town. The Comanche made no attempt to storm the center. They simply didn't need to. In one sweep, they gathered the great herds of horses grazing around Victoria, hundreds of animals at once. A number of people caught outside the town were killed. The rest watched, trapped from within their homes. For 2 days the raiders held the surrounding country, taking livestock and testing the town's defenses. Then they turned east toward the water, toward a small port most of them had never even heard of. Word of Victoria's ordeal finally convinced the frontier that the impossible warning had been true. Its name was Linnville, and by the next nightfall it would no longer exist. Linnville stood on the western shore of Lavaca Bay, the second busiest port in all of Texas. Its warehouses were packed with goods freshly landed from ships, cloth, tools, clothing, and weapons. Much of the wealth of the frontier passed through this one small town on its way inland. On the morning of August 8th, townspeople saw riders approaching and took them for traders or ranchers. By the time anyone understood the truth, hundreds of Comanche were already pouring into the streets. There was no fort, no garrison, no wall. Linnville was a merchant town, utterly unready for war. The residents ran for the water, wading and rowing out to the boats anchored in the bay. From the safety of the waves, they became a helpless audience to the sacking of their own town. The Comanche broke open every warehouse and dragged out everything they could possibly carry. For the merchants of Linnville, those warehouses held years of labor and nearly every dollar they owned. The raiders had never seen such wealth gathered in one place, and they took it as a storm takes a field. They found bolts of bright cloth, unwound them, and tied the ends to their saddles to stream in the wind. Warriors pulled top hats and fine coats from the stores and put them on over their paint and buckskin. One famous account tells of raiders galloping the beach in stolen hats, ribbons, and calico trailing behind them. They lashed plunder onto hundreds of pack mules until the loaded animals could barely walk. A customs warehouse full of government goods was thrown open, its contents scattered across the sand. The looting went on so long that some raiders grew almost playful, parading their strange new finery. One merchant, watching from a boat, saw his entire fortune carried off or flung into the mud. As the day drew to a close, the Comanche put every building in Linnville to the torch. The town burned down to the waterline while its people watched, powerless, from the bay. Columns of black smoke rose over Lavaca Bay, visible for miles up and down the coast. In a single day, the busiest port on the Texas coast had been wiped from the map. It was the single most destructive raid ever carried out against a town in Texas. But the very triumph of Linnville carried within it the seed of the disaster to come. If this story is holding your attention, take a moment to subscribe. We uncover history like this every single week. The Comanche were now weighed down by thousands of stolen animals and a mountain of loot. A raiding party's deadliest weapon had always been its speed, and plunder was about to steal it away. To haul the spoils of Victoria and Linnville, they drove a herd of perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 animals. That vast, slow-moving column couldn't melt into the landscape the way a war party normally did. Some older warriors reportedly warned that the herd was too large, that they should ride light and fast. But the younger men wouldn't give up the plunder they had carried so far, and so the column crawled on. For the first time, the Comanche were easy to follow. Their trail lay miles wide across the open prairie. Every hour spent driving that herd was an hour the Texans used to gather more men and close the gap. And behind them, all across the settlements, Texas was finally rising to its feet. Riders carried the alarm from farm to farm. The Comanche had burned the coast and were riding home. Volunteers, rangers, and militia grabbed their rifles and rode hard to cut the raiders off. Even a band of Tonkawa, longtime enemies of the Comanche, joined the growing Texan force. The Texans knew they could never catch the war party from behind, so they raced to get in front of it. They chose their ground near a stream called Plum Creek, close to present-day Lockhart, Texas. On August 12, 1840, several hundred armed men assembled in the timber along the creek. Soon they saw it. The enormous Comanche column spread across the plain beneath a rolling wall of dust. The Texan commanders argued over whether to attack at all, unsure they could break so large a force. The raiders were still driving their giant herd, slowed by plunder and certain no one could stop them. At first, Comanche warriors formed a screen, riding back and forth to shield the long pack train. Some still wore the top hats and bright cloth of Linnville, a strange and vivid sight before a battle. A chief on a magnificent horse rode out before the line, showing his courage in full view of the Texans. He wore a towering headdress and carried a shield, daring any man to come and face him. For a few tense minutes, the two forces faced each other across the open summer grass. Then the order came to charge, and hundreds of men spurred their horses out of the trees at once. Then the Texans charged, pouring rifle and pistol fire into the tangled mass of riders and animals. In the swirling dust, it was nearly impossible to tell friend from foe, warrior from settler, horse from mule. The great herd panicked. Thousands of horses and mules stampeded, tearing the war party apart from within. Warriors fought desperately to protect their families and their loot, but the column dissolved into chaos. The running battle spread across miles of prairie as the Comanche broke and scattered in every direction. Dozens of warriors were killed, the heaviest single blow the Texans had ever dealt the Comanche. Much of the Linnville plunder was abandoned, strewn across the grass behind the fleeing herd. Bolts of calico and broken furniture lay scattered where the great column had finally come undone. Buffalo Hump escaped with most of his people, slipping away toward the safety of Comancheria. But something had shifted on that field. The myth of the unstoppable raid died at Plum Creek. For the first time, the Comanche had ridden out in force and been badly beaten in the open. For the settlers, Plum Creek was the first real proof that even the Comanche could be broken in battle. For the Comanche, it was a hard lesson in the cost of fighting the Texan way in massed open battle. Never again would they gather so many riders for a single strike aimed all the way at the sea. The Great Raid of 1840 remains, by sheer scale, the largest Comanche attack in the history of Texas. It had carried a native army from the high plains to the Gulf and burned a thriving port to ash. Historians would spend generations retelling the summer the plains reached all the way to the coast. Yet it did not drive the Texans out. If anything, it hardened their will to fight to the finish. In the months that followed, Texas launched punishing counter-raids deep into Comanche country. That October, a Ranger force destroyed a Comanche village on the Colorado River in cold reprisal. The long cycle of raid and revenge would grind on across Texas for another 35 years. Buffalo Hump remained a feared and respected leader for decades, but the settlers never stopped coming. Year by year, the borders of Comancheria were pressed inward until at last the empire of the plains fell. The great herds, the open range, the freedom to ride for 1,000 miles, all of it slipped away. The people of Linnville rebuilt at a nearby landing, but the original town was never truly reborn. Today, the site is little more than quiet grass and water, with almost nothing left to mark it. You could stand there now and never guess that the busiest port in Texas once burned on that shore. But the story endures, passed down and written down, too large and too strange to be forgotten. For one furious summer, the Comanche answered a betrayal by carrying war all the way to the sea. They reminded a young republic, in fire and smoke, exactly who had ruled these plains for 100 years. The day the Comanche rode to the coast of Texas is a story worth remembering. Thanks for watching.